Welcome. We are here for the Friendly Schools podcast series. We are recording it on Noongar Whadjuk Boodja on the lands of in Perth, Western Australia, at Scots College. We're very appreciative of the old Scotch collegians and the Studio Scotch to providing us the facility here, the podcast room, for this important conversation around friendly schools. And acknowledge deep connection the First Nation community have, the Noongar Whadjuk people, of their ongoing connection to country through song and stories, and acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging, many of whom we've been very lucky to have connected with over the years, in particular Len Collard, Noel Nanup, as major mentors to me over my journey as Noongar men. So we're here today with the one and only Professor Donna Cross. I feel very lucky to be here. Donna and I've been following her work for many years, and recently I got the opportunity to connect with Friendly Schools and Donna, and now we're here for the podcast series as a way to help get the information, the evidence, the research of Friendly Schools out there to everyone who deserves it. And when you go deep and look through the research, the pages, the years, decades long of research that Donna has led, you realise, wow, we are so blessed and lucky to have this in Australia and the world to have it, and it's come out of our backyard in Perth, and it's amazing. And just want to say thank you, Donna, for leading that research.
Thanks, Lockie.
And so really excited to have you on the podcast, because obviously this is your podcast, to capture it and get it out there to as many people as we can. And so ION has the honour to be the custodians of the research for this time, and our role is around getting out there as far as we can. So part of that journey is getting a podcast series to share it, to make it accessible. There's no paywalls or anything for people to have access to this on whatever podcast series you listen to. And we're going to cut it through into 5 different areas about friendly schools. So as we get started, Donna, welcome. And I'd love you to kind of introduce yourself as a researcher and give us a bit of an intro around friendly schools.
Thanks very much, Lockie. And it's really a privilege to be here. I'm based in WA, and I work out of the University of Western Australia as an emeritus professor. But the research that we're going to be talking to today really began at Curtin University, Edith Cowan University, as well as UWA and the Kids Research Institute Australia over the last 30 years. So we're very, very privileged to try and squeeze all that insight into a series of podcast questions.
Wow. So 30 years ago, what was the catalyst that said, right, I want to do this. This is what I want to commit the next 30 years to doing?
That's a great question, Lockie. We were doing lots of research looking at different health issues. My background is a behavioural scientist, and behaviours like wearing bicycle helmets, smoking, even just crossing roads, as well as nutrition issues, being physically active, they were all issues that required a keen focus on what were the things that would help children to behave more healthfully, and often knowledge alone, as we all know, wasn't enough. It's not enough to just know it's good for us. They were being influenced strongly by what their peers were doing and kind of those normative expectations. And really, bullying was such a big factor, and it was often subtle, whether I wear my bicycle helmet or not, or whether I go out and do whatever I want to do versus what the group wants to do. And many of the schools we were working in said, look, we'll help you with your smoking research or your dietary research, but the issue we really need help with is ways to address bullying. So that was really where we started.
Wow. So that was the core, is really how do we proactively create ways around supporting or anti-bullying behaviours in school, in learning environments. That was the North Star.
Very much so, Lockie. We found that bullying often manifests into so many other behaviours. And whether it be subtle, really covert types of bullying as compared to more overt, physical, threatening behaviours, the covert behaviours were the ones that the schools were particularly struggling with. But generally, how do we help kids who feel this pressure, and maybe direct or indirect, to be able to resist that and address it in a preventive approach, as well as obviously managing it once it begins.
Wow. So I guess we're going to go through some of the research and all the different research papers. There's only I remember you're the second. I remember reading you're the second most cited research in the world on anti-bullying. Is that correct, or something like that?
It means I probably don't have a life, but yes. No, well, it's interesting. You've given me a lot of credit at the start here. I've worked with 50 people who've contributed to this work over time. Yep. 50 extraordinary, often teachers who have picked up a research element. I originally trained as a teacher, who are really keen on doing work in schools that is evidence-based. I mean, we're asked to do a lot of things, but often there isn't evidence sitting behind it. So we were all really keen to make sure that if we were going to put this effort in, that we were sure that what we were doing would make the most difference.
And I guess second to that, I remember the paper that came out was at 2017 around the cost of bullying. It was at $2.2 billion each year group.
Extraordinary, yes. When you look at the economic cost, not just the cost while children are at school from kindergarten to year 12, but also the future costs, the impact that it has on relationships and likelihood of securing employment by, for example, not being able to focus at school because you were being bullied. Those long-term costs were, as you just suggested, over $2 million per cohort per year in Australia. So an extraordinary
$2 billion, yeah?
Sorry, what did I say?
$2 million.
Thank you for correcting me. Yes, that's a significant difference.
$2 billion. Wow.
Over $2 billion.
And then so you realise, and then recently you've led an amazing initiative at New South Wales Department of Education. Do you mind sharing a little bit more light of that?
Yeah, thanks, Lockie. The New South Wales government was really interested in trying to get more evidence-based approaches in front of teachers. I think we always have the challenge in teaching that we have these committed leaders who are doing everything they can in an educational sense to support children. So when they see children with high need, for example, kids who are involved in bullying, they will grab at whatever resource they have to put it in place. But sadly, over time, there's a lot of resources that are available in schools that are either not effective at all or even harmful. So the New South Wales government was very keen to say, well, what does the evidence say? How can we help schools do more with less effort? So get that impact, but take that impact from more evidence-based approaches. So as a first step is do less. So that you can really focus on the things that make the most difference.
Yeah, right. And I guess that what we're going to talk about a bit, and the Friendly Schools product and is out there helping create a bit of the clarity through a lot of the noise out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly the research that we did in Australia was incredibly helpful to feed into this framework that's been established in New South Wales. But around the world, there's really significant quality research. But teachers are really busy. They don't have time to be wading through journal articles trying to work out what this means for their practice. So this framework is really designed to take all of that evidence, put it in really practical terms so that teachers can sort out what will help children both from a prevention perspective, from an early intervention perspective, and then for kids who are involved in bullying, what do we do to help the child who's being targeted, but also the child who's engaged in the bullying and the kids who are watching it, because, of course, they're harmed as well.
And the Friendly Schools, you've had this amazing website. It's been accessed from over 4,000 schools across the country have used it. And it's one of the leading evidence-based anti-bullying and school wellbeing frameworks out there. And so just a little way around how ION fits in this is helping translate that into more enhancing the access through digitising all the resources, making it accessible through a learning management system for out-of-hours care, training and support for teachers, and also a student-facing platform to capture the voices of students. Because one of the things sometimes in a lot of these initiatives in the wellbeing space, it's crucial to actually capture the voice of the young kids. We're all out there as adults think we know about the young kids, but sometimes we miss around their voices. And so all the evidence that I've read and ION has been advocate for is capturing the voices of young people. And that's a big thing that ION's, and that's why we're part of this journey to digitising the journey. So thank you for that. So if I was going to introduce, if people are new to Friendly Schools, they haven't heard about Friendly Schools, what is the elevator pitch, if you don't mind me asking, of what Friendly Schools is and how as a teacher it can be useful for them?
Well, the name probably provides a lot of insight. Its focus is on wellbeing and on improving the relationships that children have with their peers, with the other adults around them, obviously teachers at schools, but also parents and the wider community, so that they have the skills, the social and emotional skills, to be able to deal with situations that are both positive and those situations that are negative. They can be more resilient, they can regulate their emotions, they know how to get along with people, how to start conversations, all critical skills that give them the best possible life outcomes. Now, of course, in doing all of those things, we're also protecting kids against bullying. So whilst one of the primary outcomes that we've been able to show that this program makes a difference to is bullying, it is a wellbeing program that's about building social and emotional skills. And as you said so correctly, Lockie, the importance of student voice is just critical. And these resources, it's been 20 years of testing with multiple studies to each time feed this evidence cycle to make it better and better over time. As you said, involving young people's voices in this process was absolutely critical. And for schools to continue to engage with young people, that's so important, because areas like cyberbullying, there's not a chance as adults we can understand what young people are doing online. We might be eventually understanding it, but in the moment, we must have young people's voices. So having processes that enable young people to contribute, as we did in our research, is so important going forward.
Great. And that's a big part of what ION's contributing to this next phase, what's going on. So thank you for that. So as the context is there, this is what Friendly Schools is. We're going to go through a few different thematic kind of areas. We've mentioned a little bit, but just landing the plane, the cost of bullying. So we've got here, it's a big wellbeing concern, and we've spoken about the cost of bullying is $2.2 billion per year group, and it is just growing because of the long-term impacts of that. And we even talk about particularly, I'd love to hear your bullying. We know it's big, but then how are those vulnerable members of the community even more impacted by bullying as well? I'd love to hear a little bit more about the research and the cost of bullying that you found.
There are certainly really clear subgroups of children who are much more likely to be bullied than others, and I'll get to those in just a moment. But as you mentioned, the cost of bullying is so high because it affects children at so many levels. Obvious things like the relationships they have with other kids, their ability to build trust, the impact on their mental health over time, the impact on their academic achievement. Clearly, if I'm sitting in class worrying about what's going to happen at lunchtime, I'm not concentrating on my maths lesson or whatever that might be. Also disengages kids from schools. They're much more likely to truant or to just not come to school, not engage, not trust, not feel like they belong if they feel the schools haven't responded well. So the impact is big. Mental and emotional effects, academic effects, and behavioural effects, because we know children who bully are also much more likely to use substances. They're much more... Who
bully?
Yes, who bully.
Interesting.
And children who are bullied. Yep. So both those groups. Some of that might be self-medication. There's lots of reasons around that. But it has huge effects, and those huge effects obviously captured in that $2.2 billion per cohort per year cost, which means that the roles that schools play amongst the community, it's not the school's responsibility, but the school has a grand opportunity to address this by very focused attention on prevention. But as you suggested, there are subgroups who we know are much more likely. And when we think about early intervention, what can we put in place that will help those kids that we know are likely to be more vulnerable to bullying? And in data that we collected in New South Wales and analysed, and in other research that we've done in Australia and work that's been done internationally, we know that children who are different, and that difference can be all sorts of things, but obviously children from cold backgrounds, so culturally and linguistically different backgrounds, children from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander backgrounds are much more likely, almost 50% more likely to be bullied, Aboriginal children, than non-Aboriginal children. We know children who have a disability are much more likely to be targeted than other children. But then there are also location-based differences. The children in remote and rural areas are much more likely to be bullied than children in more urban areas and metropolitan areas. And some people sort of scratch their head, why is that the case? And often it's because of the very small peer groups that children have, that if one of their friendship groups breaks down, they don't have 30 children in their classroom to go and find another friend. Yes. And they live in the community with those same people, and there's often not good services in remote and rural areas to help children who have mental health issues. Other groups that we know are much more likely to be targeted, girls more likely to be targeted than boys. Different ways. Girls are more likely to be covertly bullied as compared to boys, who are much more overt in the behaviours they engage in. Children from lower SES backgrounds, children who are disadvantaged, are much more likely to be targeted for bullying than other groups. And there are other subgroups within each of those. Children, for example, who identify as other in terms of their gender status are also much more likely to be bullied. So as school personnel, if we think about what's the approach that we should take as part of our whole school approach to addressing this behaviour and improving social emotional outcomes, we need to be very aware of what the demographics of our student population are, which goes back to your point, Lockie, about you really need to know your students and hear from your students what it is that they want, and that the responses need to be very context specific, which is why the Friendly Schools program was designed not to be a recipe where you start at the front and you work your way through it, but more a set of principles and activities so that based on what you know about your students, so you could dive in and pick up those practical activities that will make the most difference for the students in your population as part of a whole school approach.
That is just so great to hear. And because what's coming up for me, I reflect on my journey as someone who was a bit late into speaking, got held back a year for my speech delay, then went back up, and then I had gaps, and then, diagnosed as neurodivergent, ADHD, dyslexia in support classes at school. And I was a privileged white guy living in a private school in Perth down the road. And I felt, it's pretty, I can't, and, you're in different classrooms, and then you get said things and they think it's, funny. And then you're like, oh, why am I like this? And it's really interesting thinking about my son's journey and the anxiety I get around his, a bit of speech delay, doing speech pathology, and how important it is. And then I look at, I go up to remote communities in Fitzroy Crossing, and then you hear that there's only one speech pathologist in the whole region. And there's such a need in the Kimberley and, like any remote regional town, then the kids, what chance do they have? It's very difficult. And so hearing this, it's super crucial. If one, you don't have the clinical support to help people on that journey, their alternative learning journey, how do you create a safe environment for that young person not to feel ostracized through their different ways of learning? And I think everyone knows that makes sense, but actually knowing it to actually creating environments to doing that. So I'd love to talk a little bit about what are some, maybe I'm jumping around a little bit here, but I'm just thinking on that cue around environments. What are some practical ways around schools that teachers could deploy around creating safe environments to address, decrease the cost of bullying and create anti-bullying kind of framework, environments, the school environment?
It's a great question, Lockie, because I think schools often are sort of scratching around at what can we do that will make the most difference? And curriculum is one of the first things that schools will be thinking about. What's their scope and sequence from kindergarten to year 12? What kinds of skills can we build with students? And often when they think about their approach to building social emotional outcomes, curriculum is the first and foremost part that they focus on. But our research showed that curriculum is necessary but not sufficient to get change. And as you're suggesting, we really need to focus on a system. Schools are not about piecework. If fragmented approaches give you no outcomes, if you only focus on the problem, you fail. If you only rely on one champion in your school, you fail. What outcome you need is what's known as a social determinants environmental approach, where you look at what are all the elements in an environment that make the most difference for children. Curriculum, of course, I need to learn the skills, but I also need to be in a social environment that sets a culture that says this is the way we treat each other, where teachers model that behaviour to students in their interactions with them, but also with other staff, where we see a culture of kindness. Kindness, if you think about the continuum of bullying as being bullying at the kind of worst and most heinous end, but kindness, of course, is at the other end, and that if you're in an environment where you know what that looks like and how you're expected to behave, setting that culture can make such a significant difference. So that's the social environment. But then the physical environment also, and I think you were hinting at this a moment ago, the way that we structure the time that children are out at recess and lunchtime. For children who have different needs, having quiet places for them to be able to go. In some schools that we're working in, they have this place called a breathe easy room. So kids who are really having trouble regulating can go into a space where there's a teacher present, where they can help pull down their emotion and engage. Having the libraries open so that lonely kids can go to a place where there's other kids, and maybe board games so they can interact. Thinking about how the physical environment is organised by things like the seating. So fixed seating increases bullying in a school environment because there might only be 6 seats, and if there are 10 people in the group that are sitting there, the most powerful children will sit on the seats, and those on the outside will then be less powerful. So if you have mobile seating, like individual single seats, as I've seen in a number of schools.
Stools.
Exactly. Schools, kids can create their own group, and everybody has equivalence in a sense because they've all got a seat or they've all not got a seat in places where there's plenty of seats available. But lots of examples of ways that schools can think through what creates bullying in our environment. If I've only got 4 basketballs that I put out at lunchtime, those basketballs become very powerful and the people who hold them become very powerful. So it's really kind of a mapping exercise where schools might give kids a red, yellow and green pen and a map of the school, and colour in the areas in green that you feel really safe and you love going to, yellow where it's not, and red where you don't like going, and then talking to the kids about why is that? Do we need more supervision there? Is there stuff going on that we're not aware of? So schools really thinking much more broadly, a socio-ecological approach, which is what I'm describing, horrible word, but it really means a whole school approach where we look at more than curriculum. We look at how we create environments that set kids up to have success during their break time and don't empower and increase the likelihood of bullying occurring.
Wow. And thank you for sharing that, because I remember you shared that idea around, create a map of the school, and the kids can colour code a traffic light system. And you said there's so many examples. People didn't realise, these interesting areas feel red flaggy. You mentioned was around sometimes toilets, so sometimes toilet blocks for whatever reason, and you had an example where some kids don't feel comfortable enough to go to the toilet. So then they're, and they don't drink. They don't eat because they're scared that means they go to the toilet. So show this hand, then they can address that.
It's a really great example, Lockie. We know that in schools where children are often going to the toilet soon after class starts, that's an indication, a signal that perhaps the toilets are not a comfortable place to go to during break time. So it's good for schools to really, and again, it's listening to the students, providing kids with opportunities to be able to speak up about issues that are going on where they can be anonymous so they don't feel, really obvious, so that schools can address those symptoms. You suggested toilets, like school canteen areas, often waiting at the buses, stairwells, some of the common places that children will identify.
I also remember you saying having the upside of the having one consistent teacher throughout their journey. I remember that was quite an interesting technique.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit more about that one.
Yes, this came out of research in several Scandinavian countries, and people who've been in those systems would know that children often stay with the same teacher for a considerable period of time. In some countries, children might be with the same teacher for 7 years. And clearly, with that level of intense support for children, those teachers would know families and know children really well. Of course, the system works fabulously when you've got great teachers. If a child is with a teacher who's not strong for 7 years, then that can be quite problematic. But that said, building the relationship with children is critical. And you think in secondary environments, for example, many schools have set up what they might call pastoral care systems or wellbeing approaches where they have a homeroom. They have house systems that are all about giving every child the opportunity to be known. The most fundamental finding that we had in our bullying research is that children need to be known, not just by their name, but I need to know something about you. Lockie, I know your name. I also need to know that you played football. I also need to know that you're in the surf club and that you love swimming. All of these things that say, I'm listening to you and I'm really interested in you as a person, and that I know more than what you're just famous for. Then at school you might have been the best footballer, and I'm guessing you were very
not football.
Well,
I like the idea of it.
Yes, but if we only focus on that, that's something everybody knows. But if I also knew that you played the violin, And it's like, whoa, that they care enough to understand me deeply. And I think this is a really important issue. If schools do nothing else, if they just say, look, we're way too busy to get any of these other systems or processes in place that, for example, the Friendly Schools program suggests, if they just focus on knowing the kids as well as they possibly can, know the families, have positive contact with the families, just catch up. Hey, so-and-so came to school, great to see them there, we're having a great time, this is what we're doing. Those kinds of conversations build so much social capital and reduce the likelihood, create kind environments where the likelihood of bullying behaviour, for example, is much diminished.
And I remember you sharing, I don't know if it was a teacher PD day or something like that, where you literally, the school, an exercise to help capture the, how many, the unique traits of these people, is you had a picture of all the kids or their names, and on the other side, teachers could write down, what they know about the person, or even you could do a little survey, and then everyone comes together, and it was amazing. Everyone thought that someone else knew that person well, and all of a sudden you identify there's a few kids there that no one knows anything personal about.
Indeed. It's kind of the diffusion of responsibility, isn't it? You assume that you know these kids and that others will know the other kids. But it was a really good test for the school to kind of put up the photos of all the kids in particular year groups at different meetings, piece of paper underneath, ask the staff to go around and write everything positive they know about each of those children, and then reflect on who are the children that we know well. And it's easy to know those charismatic kids who jump out of their skin when you see them. You do get to know them well, but it's the quiet kids, the kind of, some people call them the grey students. They're not good, they're not bad. They just exist within a school environment that are often unknown and feel a bit lost, have real need for a sense of belonging and connection that we can change.
And what's coming up, I think, and this talks to the need around the vulnerable or the disadvantage associated with going to lower ICSEA schools, right? Generally a higher turnover of teachers moving around, and then that, again, another level, regional remote communities where you'll have a transient teacher cohort, teachers will move on every 3 to 5 years, and then it's hard to have that continuity of care. And I think, I know governments do what they can to really, and that's why it's so important to how do we support, place-based educators in communities that we work in, Adialun, One Arm Point community, Beagle Bay, Judge and Lombardina. It's been amazing, my opportunity to go there since it's been almost 20 years now. I've been going up to the peninsula, and the volume of not just, and that's the importance of Aboriginal liaison officers and local support staff to being that continuity of care. And you realise this isn't just, it's such an essential part of creating, one's whole education journey are local people who are going to be there for a long time.
That's so true, Lockie, and the context of where you're teaching becomes so important. Therefore, the community becomes so important. So we did some research that was led by Professor Julie Coffin that was based in the Midwest Murchison region, WA, so Geraldton, Meekatharra to Carnarvon. And Julie worked very closely with the Yamatji community in that area and looked at how we could adapt the approaches that we were using in friendly schools so that they would be more useful for schools in those environments, but also what new actions should we be taking where the community was taking a much more significant role in the school, so that no matter how many teachers moved in and out, those roles and processes were well established, the culture was in the school, so that it didn't matter. Ideally, we would want teachers to stay longer, but if you can really establish those that context and liaison with the community, that can make such a huge difference in the longer term.
Totally, yeah. It's just seeing that firsthand and the importance, and anyone in the school environment, just hearing that, it just realises if you're a teacher and the importance of really nurturing those place-based approaches and the culture and the connection. That's a great example for that. So I'm just trying to, I'm jumped all over the place, but I think it's been good. We've covered a lot of these areas. So I guess on this, the whole school approach, so adding a bit of, we've spoken about anti-bullying and the cost of bullying and these things, but adopting a whole school approach would be, I really love to go around, if a school goes, wow, this is friendly school, seems like everyone knows they should be doing something on wellbeing and anti-bullying. And then I'd love for you to talk around the value of a whole school approach and go a bit deeper around, and we've spoken about some practical things that people can do. Donna, what is building a whole school approach?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Lockie. A whole school approach, as it suggests, is all the actions we can take in a school environment that will make the most difference to support children. So this includes things like starting at the top, culture. What is the culture that's established, or the school climate that a leader and members of the community engage in? So that's social environment, and how do we build that? In addition to that, the policies that we set, the procedures that we have in place. So when we think about policies, most schools will have an anti-bullying policy or a behaviour policy.
Or code of conduct.
Yes, indeed. And they'll often call them things like behaviour management, which is interesting. But a whole school approach says it's more than just punishing or controlling. It's about lifting. So maybe it's a behavioural expectations approach. So here's how we expect each other will behave and treat each other in the school environment. So really reviewing policies to make sure they reflect well-being, social and emotional outcomes, which in turn will lead to a reduction in bullying. It also relates to the partnerships with families and the community, and how they interact with the school. So often schools will use the term, engaging with parents. It kind of implies that parents are disengaged versus saying we're in partnership here. We both want the best outcomes for our children in the school environment, and what can we do that we work together that will help them the most to prevent any outcomes like bullying, but also how do we intervene early? How do we get to know your child so that we can work together to make sure they get the best possible outcome? So that partnership with parents is kind of the third major element. I already have reflected on curriculum. Obviously a kindergarten to year 10 minimum curriculum that focuses on social emotional learning, where it's taught explicitly. Now, Lockie, I know you like to play football. I like to play tennis, and I really thought one day maybe Wimbledon, but, I probably got too busy writing all those papers, and that's the only reason I didn't make it there. But if I want to be good at tennis, I need to practice, and I need to play in games, and I need to play with people that will help me. So social emotional skills are the same. They are skills, and therefore they need to be taught explicitly, just in the same way I need to be taught how to do a double-handed backhand. I need to be explicitly taught how to regulate my emotions, because it's not a natural action. Some people are better at it naturally, but they still need to improve the skill, to sharpen it up. So curriculum needs to be taught from as young an age as possible. From entry to school, play becomes so critical. So when schools reflect on what scope and sequence of actions do we have to build these skills in children, where teachers are skilled well enough to be able to deliver it, which means whole school approach includes teacher training to be able to deliver that curriculum outcome, as another critical element to a whole school approach. So far we've talked about culture, we've talked about policy, we've talked about partnerships with parents and the community, we've talked about curriculum, but the physical environment that I mentioned earlier, the physical environment can be such a critical contributor. Some people talk about it as the third space, the things that we can create that enable children to be able to interact effectively with each other. And before I lose you completely, the one last component that we build into the actions that might universally be described as a whole school approach is to think about everything we're doing using our 3 tiers of sort of multi-tiered systems of support. And that means what are the actions we're doing that will promote children's wellbeing and prevent things from happening that will harm them? What are the things that we're doing to intervene early for the children that we've identified that might be at more risk, higher risk? And what are the actions that we've got in place that are focused on those children who sadly are engaged in negative behaviours, bullying behaviours, and how are we supporting and changing that? So it's very complex. If you can kind of think of this 3D model with all of these elements addressed in prevention, early intervention, and of course treatment or caring for kids who are fully engaged, that's what a whole school model is. So it's a systematic response. It's not fragmented. It's everyone working together to get the best possible outcomes for children.
Love that. And so, there's a spectrum of school readiness. So we're really lucky Natasha's in the other room talking about a whole implementation, science, product and research that she's been working with you on for the friendly schools. So I'd love to hear a little bit more around the implementation science and what you're talking about. You've really kind of made it in a way that I understand. But then, schools are going to be on a spectrum. So can you share a bit more around what the, say, the OASIS product is, which is that survey and the whole school approach that can help identify where a school is now and then map the gap and then maybe bridge that gap and have a journey to bridging that gap?
That's for sure. And of course, when schools come to engage with a program like Friendly Schools, they're already doing some really great things, and they don't need to clean the slate and start again. What they need is to look at what are we doing that's evidence-based and what are we doing that's not, and let's stop that, let's de-implement that, so we make space and we give people air to be able to focus on the bits that make a difference. And as part of the sort of approach to implementing Friendly Schools, as you indicated, we have come up with an approach which we've called OASIS. And this approach is helping schools to think about how ready are we for where we are at to go to the next step. So that readiness can vary a lot. We can have schools that are at a really high level of readiness. They've got very skilled staff. They've got many actions already in place regarding policy, house systems to build social culture and so on. But other schools might have high turnover of staff, might need a lot more support. So what the most important thing that we need to do as a school when we're thinking about taking on something like Friendly Schools or any other program is to work out what's the skills that our current teachers have, what do they need to be able to deliver this? Do they have that already? What's their perception of what their needs are? What are the resources that they have? Are they accessible? Are they meaningful? Do teachers believe that will give them the change that they want? And there are tools that we've developed that allow schools to kind of work out how ready are we? You know, are we right at the starting point, or are there things that we need to do before we put in place? Because we know that often any initiative that we put in place, whatever it is in a school environment, it really struggles to survive without a serious commitment from schools to be able to say, yes, no, this is a priority, let's build it into our strategic plan, let's make this the actions that we need to take, and let's get our staff ready for it before we ask them to implement it. Yep. We've got a really tired workforce. They're exhausted doing what we ask them to do, and it's a lot. So to add to that workload is hard. So we have to take away first, and we have to be able to be where they're at and bring them on board.
And so a few ways how the Friendly Schools model has worked with OASIS is the identifying where the school is at on their readiness scale. And then it's identifying that, and then you have a Friendly Schools researcher or trained clinician or facilitator would come in and either virtually coach the designated leaders in the school around a journey, creating a journey, a process. And so what I've, that can take, if they're very along the journey, it can be a few months, or if they're starting from a low level of readiness, it can take 18 months, 2 years to be on that journey. But, and also acknowledging some schools, actually there's higher needs, there's a lot of moving parts right now. Adopting this could potentially do more harm. That's something that people need to be aware of.
Indeed. And I think that you have touched on what are such critical issues when you're thinking about putting a program in place, that you have a deep understanding of the context that you're in, and that you've mapped well what you're currently doing, and you've spent time working out what's gold. What in all the initiatives that we have in place to address this would we not touch? And then what are the things that are promising? So they look okay, but we're just not quite giving it the energy that it needs to make it successful. And then what are we going to stop? There are often legacy actions that have been sitting in schools for a long time. We've done it because we've always done it. There are transition programs, for example, as kids move from primary to secondary school. They've always been there, but they might not be giving or delivering the outcomes that they have. So that mapping and really deeply understanding where the humps and the dips are in the work that you have going on is such an important strategy to get started. And of course, most importantly, is having a team who sit around this, so a wellbeing team who's focused on these actions. Having one champion in a school will burn that person out too quickly. So really thinking about who might be on that team, heads of house, for example, school counsellors, maybe a school nurse, leadership, so that you have a deep understanding of the structure of the school and a group that's really comes at this issue from lots of different perspectives.
And just final on that until we go to the next one. Do you, in the time you've seen this in so many different examples in schools across the country, do you see, is it a designated group on this anti-bullying or wellbeing approach, or is it a separate group of pastoral care, or is it both of them together? I'm curious around in practice, what's an ideal mix of teachers to lead a project like this?
Yeah, I guess it's really context specific because small schools obviously have less capacity to have others on. But I think it's going into it, the realisation that you can't just have one person because that won't sustain, that you need to have not just teaching staff but also non-teaching staff, and you must have executive on board. Most schools these days have a school board. You need to have governance support around this as well. And it needs to be deeply embedded in wellbeing approaches. So when you said, do you have all these different committees? Far better if it's one group who may break into subcommittees, but that they come back as one so they always know what each other is doing, particularly in large schools where you have 1,000+ students, where it's likely that there are different actions going on, particularly in a K-12 school where your primary school might not be talking to a secondary school. Having processes that create a one school model with representatives from all of those groups is probably the best mix that you can lead to some success with implementation.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. So you've mentioned a few points there around the importance of evidence-based approaches here. And it wasn't until, you see, in the world of AI now, anyone can go on to OpenAI and say, create a wellbeing product for offering to schools. And it's risky. And people really don't understand the risk around how wicked it can be. And so you've said you've worked on the research of friendly schools for 30 years, and a team of 50 people have dedicated their lives to this research around ensuring that the approaches of friendly schools is in the best interests of people. So love to hear a little bit more around how, some of the, what are some examples of what you've heard around non-evidence-based approaches and what they can lead to. And some misconceptions out there would be interesting. Who cares out there? It creates too much harm. Don't hold back. And then we'll talk a little bit about avoiding ineffective and damaging practices as well.
Yeah, I think it's a really important issue to address, Lockie, because there is a lot of practice going on in schools that is exhausting staff, and maybe those staff don't realise that there is evidence to show that it really won't give them the traction that they're looking for. But before I do that, I'd just like to clarify the word evidence-based, because it's used a lot, and people are often of the belief that if it says evidence-based, then there's been empirical research that's informed it. But often programs that have that evidence-based tag are meaning that they design them by looking at the evidence and then writing something based on
doing
the evidence.
Their own approach.
That's true, and not empirically testing it. So what I'm talking about when I say an evidence-based approach are programs that have been tested with tens of thousands of children to make sure that if I do this work, it will make a difference for children on outcomes that we know are so critical. So Friendly Schools has done empirical research. So we, with great confidence, humble but with great confidence, suggest that there are these actions that we know that make the most difference for children, and there are actions that we could see that either didn't work or caused harm. So some of the things that make the most difference I've already talked to, but the things that cause harm are things, for example, that focus only on punishment. So in a bullying context, schools will often take a very strong punishment-based approach to bullying, and the evidence is crystal clear in our research and research internationally that when you take that approach, you create a greater problem, because there is often limited learning in that approach. It needs to be coupled with a deep understanding by the child who's engaged in the bullying as to why they're engaging in that behaviour and helping them to change it. Punishment will just push it underground. It often won't change the behaviour. We know that children who bully have issues. They have health concerns as well, and often schools will be very focused on children who have been targeted to do what they can to help those children without realising that the children who are bullying also need help. So a program that only punishes doesn't give the person who's bullying a chance to change their behaviour and learn different ways to behave. Because sadly, that's long term. And I learn to bully and I learn that's powerful. I'll use it in the workplace. I'll use it in my family. It's much more likely to lead to domestic violence outcomes. It's much more likely to be an outcome where you are not in healthy, positive relationships in the future. So it's a long-term change that we make in the lives of those children. So a keen focus, not just on punishment, is one of those approaches. I'm taking too long to explain.
No.
One,
I think these are just gems, and I think keep on going, because I think, all these different ideas, people don't know. If we know bullying's bad, and then we want to tell the perpetrator that is bad, you shouldn't do that and punish them. But actually approaching it both the individuals, because at the end of the day, the school's around creating safe environments for learning, and you don't always know what's going on at home, what's going on in their community, what they've been exposed to. And again, the responsibility isn't always on. There's so much, I just see firsthand how much responsibility is thrown on teachers, and they can be exhausted. And if you don't have an approach that is actually in the best interests of the whole school approach, and that's evidence with empirical evidence, it can be more exhausting, because essentially the issue gets worse, and it's a bit of a lack of a better word, but it can spread. It can really spread like a cancer that I've heard in environments.
That's so true, Lockie. And I think when we do employ approaches that have a really limited impact, it can not only exhaust staff, because it's not getting the impact that they want, but also creates difficulties in the greater part of the school. So if children, for example, are engaged in bullying, there are all sorts of actions that teachers can take to reduce the likelihood of that bullying. And one of those approaches that is touted a lot is something called restorative approaches. And restorative approaches philosophically make great sense. So if two kids are in conflict, and in bullying, obviously there's uneven conflict, unlike an argument, we need to help them rebuild their relationship at some point. What restorative techniques do is guide teachers through actions that they can take to help that relationship to repair. But sadly, that approach has been found to be equivocal. That means it's not been found to be effective, because some of the errors that we make in that approach is that we push the child who's been targeted and the child who has been engaged in the bullying together too quickly, and that we demand, for example, that the child who is bullying apologise to the child who's been victimised, yet the child who's victimised is terrified to be in the same room sometimes as the child who is engaged in the perpetration. So we're kind of forcing a friendship that's not ready. And even the term restorative implies that if you were being bullied by me, if we go through this technique, we'll go back to being the friends that we are now. It's very unlikely that that's the case, because we've damaged the trust. And so the approach that we need to take needs to be much more sustained and needs to be led by the child who's been targeted, not by the child who is being bullied, and not by pushing them together. So the whole approach to restorative techniques needs to be much more mindful of actions that we take that don't increase the harm to the child who's been targeted, and go at their pace. And I think that because it's been put out as a bit of a recipe, you do this first and then you do this second, schools might be rushing and of course potentially harming children en route. So restorative techniques, use them carefully. Be really mindful of what you're asking. The capital R, capital T restorative techniques, there's a program out there called that. That's the one that's been tested, and as I've said, the empirical evidence shows that it's not only not effective, it's harmful for children.
And then I guess second to that, where can people validate the products or resources they're looking at using, knowing whether they are? Because a lot of people I see, some of the biggest products out there say they're evidence informed and they reference a research paper and they're very widely used. And but how do people help quantify or validate whether they obviously you've said it, but where is there somewhere they can go?
Yeah, it's always tricky, isn't it, to have something that's objective, because people who've developed a program will of course promote it. But there's BU website, which is an independent website. They have a process that if you have a program like Friendly Schools, you submit an application and you show the evidence, the published papers, for example, peer review papers that you've developed, and the objective reviewers then score each of the programs from 4 stars down to 1 star, 4 star being the top, down to 1, and then they have a website where you can go to. So in a very objective manner, I'm interested in this program. What did it score in terms of the number of stars through BU, with a very objective process. So that's a very helpful mechanism. I'm pleased to say that Friendly Schools was 4 stars. And there aren't any other programs that address bullying that have achieved that. And I think that's really sad.
Yeah.
Because it shows that there hasn't been enough research done around the most effective strategies that make the most difference to help kids with the most difficult problem that they often experience in a school environment.
So thank you for that. And I think there's a lot more. There's actually one other that it may be a bit controversial, but I remember you mentioned there was one example around like well-being or mindfulness for, obviously I like the concept of me being a mindful individual, being calm and managing my emotions. But you mentioned actually, teaching that at certain age group, it may not be appropriate. Can you talk to a little bit more about that?
Yes, again, there's been a lot of empirical research that's been done around mindfulness, and mindfulness is fabulously effective for adults and for teenagers. And the evidence is solid, and the work that has been done to understand what those processes are and how effective they are is at the highest level. That similar level of research has found that mindfulness, in the fullest sense of mindfulness, as it's meant to be practiced for primary school children, is harmful. It increases harm for children. It increases particularly children's sense of rumination, really thinking through, because it asks you to continue to reflect on those things that are creating difficulties for you, which children's brains are not sophisticated enough. Their prefrontal cortex is not developed to the point that they can rationally approach that, and mindfulness can increase the levels of anxiety and difficulties that they're experiencing by going through that process. So I think it's kind of that, if it works for adults, then it must work for everybody. We have to be really careful that that we're using techniques for the ages that the research suggests is most effective. So for high school kids, fabulous. Adults, fabulous. Primary school children, don't go there.
So no primary, like 12 and below, not appropriate.
11 and below, I think, is the typical cutoff in primary school environments. And that's the full approach to mindfulness. There are mindful activities where I might sit and reflect on
Drawing.
something, colouring in, that are still very helpful for primary school children, but the mindfulness process is not helpful. So I know that sounds like I'm splitting hairs here around it. What we're focused on is the mindfulness program that is promoted for children is not effective for children. In fact, it's harmful versus isolated, mindful, fun activities.
Great. Okay. So, that in practice, so mindful activities around maybe drawing or engaging activities, gluing things together, as I see my son do, they're all mindful activities, but mindfulness around maybe what that looks like is that shutting your eyes and then listening to your breath.
Going through deep process. It's kind of a mindfulness with a lowercase m versus mindfulness with a capital M. The overall initiative.
Fantastic. So just to wrap it up, last little bit here, I just wanted to land the plane around structures that sustain wellbeing and prevention. I know that a lot of the work you've been doing in New South Wales government and the anti-bullying framework, there's going to be schools are going to now having to report. Is that correct? They're going to have to report around what they're proactively doing. And the federal government came out with the anti-bullying framework at the beginning of last year as well, correct? And so what's going to happen across all states and territories, the states are going to implement this. So it's better that schools are starting this process of it. So I'd love to hear a little bit about what are those, clear staff responsibilities or KPIs that you think obviously there's a whole school approach to doing this, but what are some of the ways around how schools can help track and sustain these things that we've spoken about today?
As you indicated, Australia is finally really taking actions to address bullying very seriously, both at a federal level, and then New South Wales is probably one of the first states to take that advice from the federal government and put it into actionable strategies that they should put in place, and particularly around procedures and structures within a school environment. And as you're suggesting, Lockie, there are things that we know regarding key actions, procedural actions that make the most difference. For example, induction techniques that ensure that new staff who come to the school, knowing this amazing structure that you might have set up, that you are supporting their learning so that they can deliver what the school has, what their promise is as part of their mission and approach, that there is consistency across the school. The roles that we put in place around homeroom sessions, tutor groups, whatever they might be called in different schools, where staff have a responsibility to get to know the students very well, that they are the teachers who are responsible for knowing the most about the children in their care, so that we're confident that there is at least one teacher in the school who knows a lot about their groups of children, and that it's part of their KPIs. In many schools, for example, the homeroom period, the procedures that sit around that, mark the role, and then kids can kind of sit there and do what they'd like. But some schools have been very deliberate by having cross-age groups or cross-year groups in their homeroom. So, for example, 2 from year 7, 2 from year 8, 2 from year 9, to help kids get to know and make friends with kids older and younger than them. And that's a really purposeful and great example of the value of building relationships within a school environment, because nowhere in life do we have friends who are exactly the same age as us all of the time. So putting those structures in place that enable this development of relationships is critical. So those documents talk through procedures and policies and actions that can be taken that are very deliberate, that help to build skills in kids that we know make the difference in the longest term.
And I think I was asking that, like, if you don't know, what do you do if you feel lost in this space? Like, I feel like that's a question. Like, what do you do? Obviously you got to learn and get into BU and all these different things, but I can't help but think, like, there is, like, what I've observed in the space is that everyone's so busy, and then they know they need to do something, but then sometimes actually not getting the information, it's better to not have data, because then it's not, no one can point the finger. And so this is the systemic issue that I've seen in the education system, doing this, trying to, because I was deeply, my personal connection with this, I was deeply moved by I love my school environment. I loved my experience, but sadly, I wasn't exposed to mental health or suicide. And then all of a sudden, mid-20s, all of a sudden I knew 8 people who died by suicide. And, some of them were young kids in schools. And the question goes, how does a young person feel so isolated to feel that that's the only thing they can do? And that was my big North Star to going, this is just a wicked problem. And that's why we need to create ways and safe ways for people to be able to share how they're going. And so then we can, because anyone would drop anything to support someone who's that vulnerable and about themselves and their safety. But we don't have systems to share that. And the really sad thing is I've been doing this now, I feel confident. And early on, I didn't feel confident because I wasn't experienced in the space. But now after doing this film for 8 years now, I realise the system hasn't really enabled that, because people get scared through getting inside data. They get scared through having data that if someone was to hurt themselves, all of a sudden they'd have data that could make them accountable. And then someone's head's on the chopping block to, bad reference. But that's what I've hit, the anxiety of doing this work. And I don't know, what I've observed is that there seems to be a big shift on a systemic level around acknowledging on the government that we're better off to do it than not do it, and there's enough safety guardrails. And I think it links into WorkSafe Australia, ironically, but it's taken WorkSafe Australia to legislate that it's a jailable offence if then workplaces aren't proactively managing psychosocial hazards. And so that flows down into the school. So the school now proactively has to create voices for teachers to share how they're going. A whole school approach, V1, is a culture of wellbeing, getting their voices that they feel safe, confident and supported to do their role. And then that flows down. Because if you don't have those systems in place, what chances the kids have? So this is where I think, outside of education, the systemic level is driving more adherence to these 30 years of research that you've done. Finally, the system is catching up to realising, wow, and the research has come through, it costs crazy amounts, but this whole system needs to proactively address it. So that's a bit of a rant about my story and doing it, but I do see there is a shift. And I think flowing into that, we've got a couple of things around practices that can make the most differences. love to hear around, if you've got finite resources, what are some of the practices that can make the maximum impact and through targeting resources?
That's a great question. And sort of what are the first things that I need to put into my bucket when I'm going to be addressing bullying in my school environment? And particularly because when someone says a whole school approach, that just sounds really overwhelming and it sounds like a lot of work. We think about the fundamental element, which is kind of a hint in the Friendly Schools name, is building relationships, building connectedness, and building a really strong sense of belonging. So in your school environment, for example, it might be uniforms, it might be marching to the assembly, it might be whatever those things are that are unique to the culture of the school that make you feel like you belong. When you walk into the school, do you see yourself in the school? Is there student art everywhere? Is there notice boards full of stuff about the students, not notices that are meaningless to kids? So creating an environment that's really safe and that's really kind is so important, and really setting a standard that says to everyone in that school community, it's everyone's responsibility to reduce bullying. It's not just the teachers. It's not just that committee who's been set up to make sure that bullying is running effectively in a school environment, but for the kids to see that there's stuff I can do, there's actions that I can take, and that I need to be as skilled in how to help other people as I am skilled in helping myself. And sometimes when we reflect on these programs, we're very focused on what can I do to help somebody to regulate themselves well, to help them build friendships, but also what can I be doing to make sure that everybody in the school environment is there to help and know what to do to help others. And some people use the term sort of emotional first aid or mental health first aid. And of course, that's a great way to talk about if you see somebody who's having problems like physical first aid, what can you do to stabilise them and get them to somebody else who can help them more thoroughly, like you might resuscitate somebody, similarly how you have that conversation. So seeing that peers, the actions that I take to support my same age friends, but also the older age groups of friends who I've started to develop them or younger, what are the things that I can take? What are the conversations that I need to start? Models like ones we tested in Friendly Schools, such as the LATE model, it gives us 4 things that we need to be doing every time we interact with somebody who might want to be talking to us. Those 4 things are: we need to listen. We need to be really active listeners. Tell me more about that. What else happened? How are you going? Really nice, open-ended questions. It just says, I'm really listening to you, and it's active listening. The second step that we encourage everybody to be thinking about is to acknowledge how they're feeling. So it's the LATE model, the A part of the LATE model, acknowledge that sounds really tough. Lockie, that sounds really tough what you're going through, so that you're showing that you're empathising. The third stage is to talk about options, not you should do this and then you should do this, but to say, what do you think you can do next? Or if that happened again, what might you do differently? What have you seen other kids doing in that situation? So questions that help the person see that they can have control and there are actions that they can be taking. And that the fourth step, so far we've listened really hard, we've empathised, that sounds tough, we've helped them think through actions that they can take. The fourth is to end with encouragement, to let them know you can come back and talk to me again. This is not a one-off. Let me know how you go. I'll see you again on Wednesday. Or, it feels really tough now, but I'm sure it'll get better, but I'm here for you. So that closure that says you've still got me, even though our conversation is finishing, being able to build those skills in a school environment where everybody sees they have a responsibility, like a broken swing. Got to tell somebody that needs to be fixed. I've also got a responsibility if I see somebody who needs that support. So relationships being fundamental to that approach.
And I guess what comes up when I hear that, like how purposeful that is for everyone. We know love the concept of, what a religious background it is, but the golden rule around love, and loving thy neighbour, the connecting with others, is actually you get energy through that. And it's not about handballing it to the school psych potentially or the wellbeing office. It's actually I can play, and that's a simple way to feel create a safety for the young person to feel safe, heard, and supported. And one thing I hear to that as well is like on a concept of psychosocial safety is around being proactive, not necessarily always waiting on them to reach out to you. It's about actually, hey, I'd love to check in again on this maybe next week, and take that burden off them to do it, because I've heard, on my experiences as well. As an adult, it's a universal thing. We can do that, and thank you for sharing that, because I think it's a foundation around just good character. As Australian, we're having this dialogue as what is Australian value? It's around supporting each others and being good people and supporting our mates. And so I think it really lands on that, and we can start flexing that muscle and strengthening that muscle through in school environments. When people see that in their schools, they're more likely to live and breathe that as they get older.
Absolutely. But if they see someone is really experiencing difficulty, they are taking them to somebody who can provide them with more help.
And that's exactly, and I think it's really important we acknowledge that. And there are those systems there, but you also know better than most, the overload of psychologists in schools. There's a lot there, and they can't take that strain. So I guess, and that's why we need a whole school approach.
Indeed, and that and links with the community. So those relationships with community agencies, for example, so that schools can facilitate that connection being so critical as well.
Awesome. So just as we wrap up, I'd love to just hear a little bit more from you around the importance of maintaining the researcher-friendly schools, getting it out there, and if there are schools or researchers out there listening, what message do you have to them?
Thanks, Lockie. We've obviously been doing lots of research, but that research never sits still, and there's new behaviours that are identified all the time. For example, we were in the early 2000s noticed that children were telling us through the surveys that they were being bullied through their mobile phones or their telephones at the time, and we were fortunate enough to have funding to be able to follow that behaviour and understand it more deeply. Continue over time. Of course, cameras became available on phones, and we were able to monitor what happened with sexting behaviours and other behaviours that having images facilitated. And of course, the behaviour is morphing all the time. So ensuring that we stay on top of those new behaviours and that we have insights that allow us to be much more targeted and careful with the actions that we take to support young people, making sure that we're constantly talking to young people and children to know what their needs are, so that we can ensure we deliver outcomes that are meaningful. But most importantly, also understanding how schools are operating and what schools need and what are the actions to support their implementation. We talk about mapping and helping schools fill the gaps, but schools often need a deeper understanding of the processes that make the most difference. So science needs to be looking not only at young people and the actions that they're experiencing and what can help them, but also what are the actions that schools might need more insight into to maximise their implementation.
And so on that, as a person who's been leading the way in anti-bullying, globally in this space, and I'd love to hear some thoughts around the impact you see AI having on this bullying space. We see a lot of cyberbullying. It was back on Facebook, social media a few years ago, and some tragic circumstances around that. But now AI, how is that going to impact this? The road ahead to schools to navigate, and how some ideas around navigating AI.
It's a great question, particularly when you asked in the previous question about what research is needed, and it's a perfect example of why we need to continue to monitor what young people are experiencing in online environments. The obvious issues that the online environment creates with AI are things like deep fakes and being able to create images or create stories with quite believable images and information that can trick and obviously put people in very vulnerable positions they might not otherwise experience. Similarly, AI in a more positive way is providing opportunities for children to have conversations and build relationships with non-human discussants around issues that they might want to have more insight. And whilst perhaps they're being developed with good intent, there isn't good science that sits behind them to know what the potential harms are, or what we might call iatrogenic effects, positive intention but negative outcomes. And so the science needs to keep up with what young people are experiencing. And sadly, we're a terrible analogy, but we are building the aeroplane while it's flying, because kids are there and they are in these spaces, they are being tempted. Their behaviours are being influenced, how they treat each other, consent issues, respectful relationships, perhaps norms that are being established in online environments through AI or just through the influence of certain characters that can influence the way a young person might think that they should or may treat other people around them.
So if there was a parent out there who's a bit listening to this podcast and feeling anxious around their kids and AI, what's some ways around either a teacher could have the dialogue in schools or teachers, parents could have with their kids around AI?
I think AI, but broadly just online environments where young people are spending time. AI is tricky, but perhaps kids are also engaging in other behaviours online that can put them at high risk. And I think for parents, an easy way to think about it is to consider an online environment the same way they think about a swimming pool. And I'll explain my analogy here, that a swimming pool is a place for great fun. And there's lots of great stuff you can do there. Online environments are the same. There is a lot of wonderful things that kids benefit from as a result of engaging in online environments. We can just ban children from going to those environments until they turn 16. Now, imagine if we did that with a swimming pool. You can't go in a swimming pool until you turn 16, no matter how much fun it is. We're not going to teach you how to swim better. We're not going to teach you how to help others. We're just going to stop you from going there until you turn a certain age. Instead, when we think of swimming pools, we don't let our children swim alone, particularly when they're little. We supervise them constantly. We put fences around the pool to keep children safe. We teach them how to swim effectively. We teach them first aid. All of these actions that we might just naturally do around an unsafe environment, we're not transferring to an online environment. Parents should not be letting their children use technology alone. It should not be allowed in their bedrooms ever. As much as children might tell my children, for example, how will I get up in the morning, Mum? It's my alarm. I'll buy you an alarm clock. The phone stays in the kitchen. Actions that we should be taking, parenting, where we are very clear about how to keep our children safe in the same way we would keep them safe around a swimming pool, are the exact same actions we should be thinking about online. Swimming at dusk in a storm is a bit like being online with AI. We would never let our children near an environment like that, particularly if they were young and unskilled. Yet we allow our children to have the potential access to AI. We need to be much clearer about those rules.
I love that analogy. Thank you so much. And I think you did also allude around this age 16, and obviously that's quite topical. Australia is one of the first countries to implement the social media ban. And so just love to a few cents on that. Have you thought much about that? What are your thoughts on that? Or you have a position on it? You don't? I'd love to hear it.
I think everybody probably has a position on it. Fundamentally, it's a terrific idea. Can it be implemented? I think everyone is challenged by that. I think there's some pluses and some minuses that really jump out for me. The pluses are that it sets a norm. It's a bit like a law. We might not be able to implement it, but at least it says to parents, there's something you need to pay attention to here. If the law or this recommendation is saying 16, why? So it might prompt perhaps children who are still very young and their parents are thinking about buying them a phone. It might encourage parents to be much more proactive because it's not just them who are saying no. The law is saying no. So I see a sort of normative benefit from that. Tough for kids who are now using, but as children progress through, that might be helpful. The negative side is that when children muck up online, they don't tell adults until things start to get really messy. Our research has shown that really well. And, often when they should tell somebody earlier, they can't because their parents said they couldn't go to that site or they've said they shouldn't use their phone, at night. So they won't speak up until it gets quite serious. I fear now that not only have they maybe broken their parents' rules and they've done something they shouldn't be doing, but now they've also broken the law. Will they wait even longer before they seek help? So my concern is, how do we enable kids to speak up when it gets messy? Because it can get very messy very quickly and puts children at great risk of self-harm if we don't act and support them as early as possible. So as parents, just establishing those communication, tell me no matter what it is, no matter what rule you've broken, tell me because I want to help you because I love you first, is probably the most important issue, I think.
Wow. I love that, and just really it comes to one-on-one, having a strong bonds with the kids. And this is a lot of the work. I know you've done a bit of work with the Fathering Project and a lot of different things out there, just having those bonds, the context and time and stories. And I guess what I hear is that, wow, the child does, obviously sometimes parents now in this day and age, the cost of living is high, kids get entertained through movies, social media, whatever it is. Let's go back to what it was like. 40 kids believe it or not, got through without devices.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah. And so I think that's such a great way to end. And but I guess just to wrap it all up, I'd love for IARN to share with you how honoured we are to take on this, this role and put it out there to anyone listening. If you want to hear more about the Friendly Schools, the website friendlyschools.com.au, both domestically, internationally, the information. Donna wants to get it out there to more people. And IARN is a group who's helping translate that. So offering resources online and trainings and support, and also open to for more people to contribute with research, which is a big thing.
It is, Lockie, and look, we feel really, really privileged because we're researchers. We're not good at promoting and disseminating these resources, and research is no good if it stays with researchers. It needs to be out and being used and applied as much as we can. And we feel like we've got a bit of a very strong responsibility. We've been given public funds to do this research over 30 years, and we need to make every effort that we can to ensure that it gets out there. So the partnership with IARN is just such a terrific opportunity to be able to make the best of the opportunities we have with the skills that you and your team have.
Thank you very much. We might wrap it up. Thank you, Donna. We say Budawan, which is a Noongar word for until next time.
Indeed. And until next time. Thanks, Lockie.